right, we're rolling. I'm Leroy,
I'm Ben.
and we are doing our podcast on Spindletop. So, for a quick introduction, Spindletop struck oil nearly 9 years after the initial attempts with a revolutionary rotary bit that was heavier and more efficient, which made it possible to overcome the tough oil sands. It was discovered by Higgins, but he was cut out of the deal by Guffey, Galley, and Lucas. Guffey and Galley received 7/8 of ownership, and Lucas received 1/8. The initial production was 100,000 barrels per day, just 9 days after striking oil, which was unprecedented for the time. Beaumont's population, which is the town that Spindletop was on, Beaumont's population surged from 10,000 to 50,000 nearly overnight. There was a financial frenzy where $235 million, equated to almost $1 billion today, was invested within a year in Beaumont. Property values skyrocketed from $150 to tens of thousands essentially overnight as well. So in class, we discussed the overproduction and collapse of prices due to a failure to control production by federal and state government, but we wanted to figure out what the core problem was and why it was so difficult for producers and operators to control themselves when it came to production. So we asked the question, why was it so difficult for Spindletop oil producers to responsibly manage production? And to begin, I'm going to hand it over to Ben.
Yeah, and so really one of the first key places we kind of wanted to start at was looking at the regulation that Texas did or did not, try to impose. And this is a really good place to start with. And just kind of as a little background info to start this kind of section here. In the 20th century, Texas was the largest oil and gas producing state in the country, but it was the only one with no compulsory unitization laws, which assume efficient recovery of oil. So basically, either Texas oil operators were incredibly cooperative with another, or Texas was wasting a lot of oil. And we'll kind of see that come to fruition throughout this podcast. We'll kind of see where that really goes. And just kind of to get us there a little bit here, a stat that we have is by the 1980s, which is obviously a little bit further off from the initial Spindletop oil strike, Texas, even with the legacy of Spindletop, had 88% of the world's oil wells, but only 12% of total production. And that really kind of answers that question from above, that Texas was obviously just over time had wasted a lot of oil. And this really allows us to see that there weren't a lot of regulation efforts, especially at the get-go from the first strike that we kind of hit on above. So basically what we see as the result here is there were over-drilled fields, and like I said, tons of wasted oil resources, and just over time, there's a lot of rapid declines in production, because when you don't have a lot of regulation, you're going to have a lot of people out there with as many derricks as possible trying to simply, get as much oil as they can to get as much profits as they can. And so as time moves along, as you continue to try to produce, you're going to have those declines in production. And so a stat we see that in 1902, which is kind of around a year after the first discovery, there had been about 17.5 million barrels produced. And then already by 1904, which was only 2 years later, it was about 3 million barrels, which obviously shows, just great declines in production. And it just shows how much people were chasing the profits. And so from one of the sources we kind of utilized for this research to develop this podcast, we just saw that a lot of calls for conservation were ignored. Because kind of as I've hit on, producers really just prioritize their own profits over waste management, and that is definitely something we'll hit as we continue to talk here. And another really key thing that kind of utilized and kind of helped build up this section here was a selection of photographs that we found. And what those photographs showed were oil derricks that were just packed so tightly together. And what it really showed was just large overcrowding and the inefficient use of land and resources. And this really kind of allowed us to see that regulation wasn't really prioritized, because with regulation, you obviously wouldn't have so many derricks just thrown up right there together, thrown up in such close proximity to one another. And if you're regulating production, regulating the resources that you can pull from the land, people are going to have to spread out. People are going to have less derricks, and you just wouldn't get photographs like that. And so the fact that we were able to find many, photographs and postcards that were being utilized to kind of show Spindletop, show the Beaumont area, and show what was going on just really proves, just how there just wasn't much regulation. And it really serves as a pull to get people to come out to Beaumont, come out to Spindletop to try to find their own oil. And, really hits on the idea that they're not going to have to worry about regulation and they're just going to be able to do what they want. And this was also a key point kind of with regulation that a lot of people around the world were kind of shocked by. And some other people that we saw that, had an understanding come from places of the world that had understandings of the oil industry. They were kind of surprised about what was going on in Texas and Spindletop. And a big thing we've seen in class and that we kind of throw in here is that, Saudi Arabia is obviously in the Middle East, obviously one of the big oil producers that would come down the pipeline after Spindletop and would, dominate sort of the oil industry. There was a Saudi Arabian University of Texas student who saw a lot of these derricks when they first came down and really got into discussing these differences between the two oil environments. He claimed that there would be a lot less wells in Saudi Arabia and that would produce more oil in general, and that the difference that he saw in Texas was that there were thousands of wells that produced just various amounts of oil in the United States. And just, really what this shows is that not necessarily that there was regulation in these other places, but you can kind of infer that there probably was to a certain extent. And because this comes after Spindletop and because it kind of comes after the initial, Spindletop boom and the Pennsylvania boom in the United States, oil men in the United States obviously understood, what they needed to do, what they needed to regulate, and what they needed to kind of cut back on so they would actually be able to continuously pull resources, pull profits in from those resources, but still regulate enough to where those profits would last more than, even more than just like 5 years. And that kind of hits on that point above where, declines in production were very rapid. And that just shows that without regulation, you're going to lose a lot of profit. You're going to lose a lot of resources very quickly. And that has a lot of factors, plays into that for sure. And a big one that we can kind of transition into here is the independent operators who have just, very strong desires and motivations that the bigger corporations don't necessarily have. And so for that, I'll throw it over to Leroy.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So following the second wave of Texas oil on the flanks of Spindletop and Dad Joyner's discovery of the Black Giant, most producing states in the U.S. enacted compulsory unitization statutes along with the voluntary industry regulation. Oklahoma, who along with Texas had created an oil glut previous due to overproduction to the second Spindletop wave, complied to slow production. So Oklahoma was very willing to comply. They went to extreme levels, even developing even deploying the National Guard to put an end to reckless production. While Texas was largely responsible for the, lack of a better word, irresponsible production along with Oklahoma, they did not follow their lead. Texas refused to establish compulsory unitization statutes, and most of the Texas oil industry passed on voluntary production control as well. This prevented unitization and prevented controlled influxes on the market.
Yeah, so Leroy, a question some of our listeners might have and that might be listening, they might be kind of wondering, as they can kind of see what we mentioned so far, they might be wondering just kind of why this is in general, right? Like if Texas is making so much money from oil and they're so reliant on that oil money, don't you think that they would want to like employ sustainable practices, kind of in their oil industry?
Right, yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, Ben, to put the significance of Spindletop into perspective, by the 1980s, the United States owned 88% of the world's oil wells, a majority of them from Texas, yet we were only responsible for 12% of the global production. So what this tells us is that Texas was full of dreamers, was full of the independent drillers who were just looking to take part in potential riches. And they all had their own individual interests, and they all had a bunch of different moralities. some who cared about sustainability, and others who were just there to get the quick buck. And this was just extremely evident during this period. There was an estimated 586 small operators, all with their own interests and moralities, as I mentioned earlier, that were producing nearly half, 49%, of the oil from only 20% of the land in Texas. And I mean, that just means that they're pumping out oil like that. And these independents were extremely effective in the rule of capture and finding pockets of oil and removing them as quickly as possible to remain competitive with larger established companies. They were forced to compete to turn a profit. I mean, the large companies had the majority of the land, the majority of the stakes in the oil pools. So they were forced to compete to turn profits that were marginal enough to make the dangerous and insecure work worth the sacrifice. I mean, these people had traveled from all across the country, and they'd put a lot of money and time and effort into a dangerous job, and of course they wanted to get the most out of it. The independents gained more than their fair share from the unregulated resources, and therefore there was absolutely no incentive to comply with the federal requests to voluntarily unitize production. Unitization and regulation would have essentially been the death of them. They made their profits from reckless production, and they were absolutely not going to stop at all. So, not to mention, during the period, we look back at David Day from class, who speculated that oil would be nearly gone by the 1920s and pushing into the 1930s. So by the time Spindletop had experienced a second major breakthrough, right in the period that it was assumed by people like David Day that we would be running out of the resource, I mean, that just didn't make sense to private oil, that didn't make sense to the industry, so they became extremely suspicious, and they did not believe in the potential for a shortage, and therefore this pushed the further narrative that they were not going to stop drilling. But back to the independent operators, during the period of pressured unitization, independent operators felt threatened by major companies who were attempting to vertically integrate and take ownership of nearly all of Spindletop and create a monopoly over the resource. They testified that majors used their pipeline power to force them out of their leases and surrender autonomy. William Farish is a great example of this. He was a loud and very forceful advocate for unitization, but was also the president of Humble Oil, which was a company that intended to become one of the single unit operators of the region. And this furthered suspicion of unitization and painted companies like Humble Oil and William Farish, who were pro-unitization, as vilified masters of the East Texas oil fields. Now, Humble Oil and companies like were also pushing for fair shares, which means the amount of property they own should equate to the amount of crude that they were allowed to produce. This was extremely concerning as we look back at those 586 small operators who did not own much land at all, but because of the rule of capture, they produced half of East Texas's oil. And with unitization, that never would have been possible. And with fair shares, that absolutely never would have been possible. So the independents were winning the race under the rule of capture, and they were turning immense profits without regulation. And the connection between monopoly and regulation led to absolutely no independent willing to settle for fair shares when they gained an unfair share because of its proposal. As a result of this, unitization and production control occurred a lot later in the lives of Texans in East Texas. In fact, throughout all of Texas, essentially. So to kind of wrap this up, the effect of independent operators on Spindletop and the difficulties oil producers had with responsibly managing production stemmed from the dominance of independent operators who fiercely guarded their profits under the rule of capture. Independents were wary of monopolistic threats from major companies, and they were extremely skeptical of resource scarcity. They saw regulation as a direct attack on their autonomy and their livelihoods, and the tension between unregulated individualism and centralized control in the form of major companies such as Humble Oil delayed the sustainable practices, defining the chaotic and profitable rise of Texas oil to a T. The neglect the operators had for producing oil sustainably did not just have negative effects on the economy, but also the environment. And I'm going to hand it over to Ben to discuss that further.
Yeah, and that's a really good bridge point there for sure. And we really when you combine our kind of first two segments with the lack of regulation and independent producers, we really can jump really good into geological mismanagement and hazards that were really kind of characterized the spindle top and Texas oil industry, especially early on, very well. So just kind of in basic terms of environmental hazards, there were many unplugged wells and pollution due to unregulated operations. And kind of like we're kind of been hitting on throughout, when you have these unregulated operations, right, you have derricks being thrown up everywhere. You have independent operators trying to get oil wherever they can, and they're not, coordinating or operating within the boundaries of some of the larger corporations that actually were, trying to cooperate and kind of regulate their production, other people's production. That's going to lead to unplugged wells and pollution because they're trying to get oil, and they're trying to get it within their own boundaries, within their own desires, and they're not worried about anyone else. They're trying to produce as much as they can and make as much money as they can as quick as possible so that they can get back out in the field, keep going, and keep trying to turn over a profit in this very large industry. And kind of like I said, these unplugged wells and pollution was just largely because of all the derricks. They're getting thrown up. And, when they're thrown up so close together like that, kind of like Leroy hit on with the rule of capture, with all the derricks being right next to each other, you're not just drilling straight down. As we've have kind of seen throughout our research and throughout class itself, we've seen, oil obviously isn't just in a specific, bucket under the ground. It's like in a large pool underground, and all the derricks that are drilled down into the ground pull the oil from wherever they're pulling it from. So you could have two derricks right next to one another, and they're obviously going to pull oil from very similar spots. So with them being thrown up so close to one another, they're going to pull it from the same places. And so this is going to lead to, just a lot of pollution, a lot of problems with the land itself. And as Leroy mentioned above, the independent producers played such a role in this. And kind of like I've hit on a little bit, they're so motivated by their own desires and not motivated by the desires of others that their operations aren't going to be as smooth as the larger corporations who are trying to produce such a refined product and really put out the best product possible. The independent operators are trying to produce as much as possible and just get a product out there on the market so they can turn over a profit. And from kind of this whole, cycle and situation we have going on here, there was an estimated $200 million of oil lost due to poor conservation efforts in Spindletop's early years and really in the first couple decades of Spindletop. And, that is a big blow, especially looking back on it now. Obviously, in the moment, those producers aren't really going to think about that. They're not going to think about the money that they, didn't gain, and they're not really going to think about it too much, especially as we kind of meant that's in the early decades, in the first couple early years. Obviously, as we'll kind of see as we get into a little bit later, there's obviously more of a attempt when we kind of get into the second boom period, and people will start to realize how much oil they're kind of wasting, how much money they really are losing to conservation. And this is something that's kind of really similar to the Pennsylvania oil strike, which was, one of the first couple ones. They produced oil so quickly, and the boom bust cycle was just so similar there as it is here in Spindletop and Beaumont. And, it really just shows how much money actually was lost in oil products just because people didn't care about regulation. They didn't care about how to manage the land, how to manage the geological aspects of the oil industry. And obviously, this just is going to lead to hazards. And overall, this kind of leads to this kind of cycle and economic fallout in a sense. And as we kind of hit on above, as the oil industry keeps growing, obviously in the United States, but it grows elsewhere outside the United States as, more oil resources pop up, more oil is needed. The Middle East obviously incentivize Texas and the United States to get better about their geological mismanagement, so they're not losing, that estimated $200 million of profit because of just poor conservation. And so what the Middle East does is it really just creates this atmosphere of competition, and as they're producing, as they're making money, obviously the independent producers back in the United States and, the just homegrown United States-based companies that aren't, going over to the Middle East and trying to produce there and then ship oil elsewhere. What it does is just incentivize them to produce more, but to try to, prevent this sort of geological mismanagement. But in this economic fallout kind of cycle, the legislature, they really tried to resort to tax breaks and certain incentives to sustain operations during downturns. But, that just, it makes it really tough. It makes it tough because when you've already wasted so much money on oil and so much money on, the resources, and you've lost resources and lost money due to poor conservation, I mean, it's going to be tough even during downturns, because as Leroy kind of hit on, people are already predicting kind of early on how oil was going to run out. And as we all know, and as we've all kind of seen throughout learning, and you just know oil is not a unlimited resource, it's a finite resource. So geological mismanagement hazard is one of the last thing you want to have in an industry like that, because if you are wasting oil, losing oil, on your own merits, on your own efforts, you're obviously not going to be in a good spot. And it just really shows how you want to avoid that geological mismanagement hazards. But ultimately, kind of back to the point here with the economic fallout in the Middle East, which really grew in post-World War II, obviously because of how much Texas had struggled with the management of the land, management of the geological aspects. The Texas operators just couldn't compete with Middle Eastern oil post-World War II. And this is even with those federal tariffs and quotas. I mean, kind of as I hit, when you've already lost so much of your resources, so much of that oil that's in the ground, and where everybody's pulling from the same pools, you're just not going to be able to compete, especially when the Middle Eastern oil at this point was really kind of untapped. It wasn't really hit on that much yet. And obviously, as we know, I mean, it grows to just great amounts in kind of that post-World War II period, as I said. And so when you've already kind of wasted a lot of stuff and you don't even know it yet, you're ultimately not going to be able to compete. And so I think that's a good little section there to hit on that stuff.
Yeah, thank you, man. You make a great point. Just to transition, because of poor conservation, geological mismanagement, and essentially the overall abuse of the natural resource, oil was becoming a very unfavored industry. And this was known by the oil majors. Therefore, the second boom, which started, I believe, 1925, attempted to regulate, but the previous damage of the initial oil boom had proved a little bit too dramatic on the industry. The second Spindletop boom occurred when Mars McLean speculated that production could be found on the flanks of the dome. He was proved correct on November 13th, 1925, when the Yontley Oil Company brought in a well and drilled 5,400 feet into the flank, striking oil. As we covered earlier, the second wave was more controlled than the first, with major companies willing to unitize and regulate production, pushing for fair shares of crude oil and crude oil production proportionate to land ownership, as I mentioned in the independent section. But just to be clear, these guys did not really care about conservation. They just wanted to stabilize prices so that they can make greater profits and push out the independents. As I mentioned earlier, it was an unfavorable industry at the time, so they also wanted to regain a better name for themselves. While the second wave was definitely more controlled, it still yielded an all-time high of 21 million barrels coming out of East Texas in 1927. And within 5 years of this, another 60 million barrels had been unearthed by the East Texas drillers.
Yeah, so Leroy, to kind of throw it back to our listeners here who might kind of be wondering, all this, as we have kind of mentioned and hit on, kind of talks about how oil is, as you mentioned, like just the abuse of the natural resource. They might be kind of wondering, how is this possible? That they kind of reached an all-time high. Like, if the Texas majors were finally kind of willing to play ball, and comply with the federal production regulation, and just kind of, not just operate outside the bounds of any kind of controls. How did more oil end up being produced in the second boom than the first one?
Yeah, so as we've already touched on, the irresponsibility of independent sellers played a large role in the second boom, but they were absolutely not the only ones abusing the industry and abusing the system. While large corporations were willing to play their part, one of the reasons that responsible production management proved to be difficult was the lingering effects of the previous boom, and the effects that it had on the region, the culture, the creed, everything about it. The culture of greed had already been established in the area, and then proved to be very dramatic on the industry. During the second boom, this was reflected in the form of irresponsible discovery tactics, the leasing out of land, the deals that came with it, and hot oil, as we talked about a lot in class. So for the irresponsible discovery tactics and deals, we can look at a figure like Dad Joyner, who's known as the father of East Texas oil fields. Now, Dad is responsible for the lucky strike of the Black Giant that served as a reawakening of the East Texas oil boom in 1930. While the strike was revolutionary to the area, Joyner tended to oversell his interests in the leases, and it's hard to blame him. Up to this point, the norm of Spindletop and the surrounding areas was to get in and get out with as much money in hand, with as much profit as possible, and get home. At least that was what it was for the independents. And not to mention, this discovery came during a time of oil glut and global depression in the 30s. So discoverers like Joyner wanted to set themselves for this foreseeable future, and make their way through the broken economy without tripping. And this reckless selling of oil leases brought down harsh lawsuits on Joyner from majors and activists of unitization that were attempting to seize his findings. But the damage had already been done. He'd already leased out all of these properties, and this just further pushed the independents on what we already spoke about earlier. And the norms of the original boom had essentially infiltrated the new boom of the 20s and 30s. Also, on top of this, Dad Joyner was able to still keep his profits and was unscathed by these lawsuits pushed by the majors of oil, as he sold 5,500 of his acres to HL for $1.26 million. And this shows us that even when irresponsible production management was caught and attempted to be dealt with, it was easy for reckless people uninterested in sustainability to just kind of bypass the punishment and continue exploring for short-term investments. So another reason along with this for why it was so difficult for Spindletop to regulate was there was just absolutely no incentive for anyone other than majors during this period. Along with the irresponsible tactics of discoverers that stemmed from the effects of the previous boom, hot oil became increasingly tied to the difficulty of Spindletop oil producers who faced irresponsible management of production across the board. So during the early 1930s, the impact of hot oil on the market kind of reached its peak. This coincided just as Texas reached the unprecedented 5-year period, which I mentioned earlier, where the production soared to record levels exceeding 60 million barrels during the stretch of 5 years. Now, it's impossible to prove that hot oil was a mass contributor to these record numbers, due to a good portion of hot oil going off the books or illegally marked as legitimate production in compliance to regulation. But I think it's fair to assume that hot oil did have a large impact on these numbers, proving its intense effect on the region's ability to responsibly produce. So this black market trade reflected and fueled the fragmented nature of the industry, and how the first initial boom had left it. They picked up right back where they left off, where enforcing regulation was nearly impossible given just the sheer numbers of small producers willing to bypass the laws to stay competitive. The history of overproduction and market saturation, almost entirely created by the prevalence of hot oil, it highlighted the deep structural challenges in moving the spindle top oil industry toward responsible management during the second boom. So yeah, just to wrap up, the second spindle top boom highlighted just the lingering damage of the region's earlier oil rush, where a culture of greed, reckless tactics, and fragmented competition left a lasting imprint on the industry. And these factors just made it nearly impossible to establish a responsible production practice in the area. And it just essentially ensured that the chaos of the first boom would carry over into the second.
Yeah, so as you kind of mentioned, to kind of conclude down from your point there, and just really from our points throughout this entire podcast and just our research that we've done that's gone into developing this podcast, you really can learn a lot of lessons from Spindletop, that lessons, that can really be taken into the oil industry of the time, the history of the oil industry, but then really into the modern oil industry as well, and just what, we as, students and learners can learn from this, but also what, producers of today can learn from and kind of build on and grow on as they try to, continuously try to gain profits from oil, and especially with this new era of kind of, the fracking technology and stuff that has developed today. But really the key takeaway that we saw from developing this podcast and from really researching a lot into Spindletop and the Texas oil, discovery and boom period was that Spindletop's story definitely underscores the consequences of unregulated competition and really just the tragedy of the commons. And, so really that kind of just shows our closing thought that really by failing to balance, their own economic ambitions with geological responsibility, Spindletop really just became a cautionary tale and a catalyst, as I kind of mentioned, for the modern oil industry today. As we saw throughout this, that the independent producers and even the kind of larger producers, larger kind of corporations that kind of developed from the get-go, they all felt the consequences of the tragedy of the commons and kind of the rule of capture. Whereas Leroy kind of mentioned the section above, they were trying to produce as much as possible and really just get out of there, kind of like Dad Joyner was with as much money in hand, and weren't really concerned about, the geological outcome that was really happening on the land there, or, any sort of regulation laws or anything like that. So to kind of answer the thesis we posed from the beginning, our overall answer to our question was really the reason why it was so difficult for Spindletop oil producers to responsibly manage production was largely because of the independent producers, but without a doubt, you just can't ignore the culmination of many other factors that, played a role in this. And kind of those outside factors of the independent producers would just be the irresponsible leasing of people, which really just caused, land speculation to really rise as they were trying to, get people into the oil industry, and people were willing to pay it, which definitely hurts the economy. And then you see the suspicion of the shortage of the resource itself, and people were obviously going to try to produce as much as they could, obviously worrying about the shortage of oil so they could get as much profits as they could and just really kind of get out of there and not have to worry about it anymore. We also saw how the major companies were pushing to vertically integrate, and they were trying to create these large corporations to own as much of the land as they could and produce as much as they could, which definitely kind of hurt Spindletop, especially when you throw that in there with the independent producers. And then you also just see the significance of hot oil that, really just kind of brings it all and all those factors to a head. And so, without a doubt, the individual motivations and desires of these other factors definitely pulled and pushed the independents in their own directions. But the fact that, along with their own motivations and desires, they were having to deal with all these other factors, all these people trying to get involved, the people trying to produce profits, produce oil itself, was why. And the answer we came to was this was why it was so difficult for these Spindletop oil producers to responsibly manage their own production and, just be responsible with what they were doing. And so, yeah, that'll really bring our podcast to a conclusion here. Hope you guys can take something from this and can get a good listen out of it. And we appreciate you for tuning in.
Yep, thank you.